All right, good morning, everyone. Wednesday, April 2nd. I hope you had a great Fool's Day. 9:30, we're picking up work on H233, an act relating to requirements for state funded grants. We heard last week from a bunch of folks from the nonprofit sector. And today we have folks in from agencies administration. So just kick things off. We have Secretary Clark. Good to see you, Secretary.
See you. My first time in the new committee. It's really nice. It's really nice. So good.
We're content. Yeah.
Great. So for the record, I'm Sarah Clark. I'm the Secretary of Administration. Here to talk a little bit about, and in some ways, continuing conversations we had last year, but to talk about what exists now in bulletin and process for state government. I don't know, I have some slides that I shared. Would you like for me to share my screen or?
Do you prefer we can pull it up on our devices?
Okay.
If you want to do a screen, go for it. Yeah.
Maybe if you have it on your devices, maybe that's easiest.
Yeah. We'll just do that one.
Get distracted. So great. So let's jump right in. I should say that I have Jordan Black-Deegan here with me today. He's the statewide grant administrator. And so any sort of really detailed questions he'll be able to answer. And he has a great passion for grants administration. And so we're lucky to have him as a resource in state government. So okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit, an overview about our administrative guidance and give some context and maybe some updates from as a result of conversations we had with this committee and some of the other testimony we heard last year. What are some updates that we made to Bulletin 5? And then I have some specific feedback and considerations for the bill that you are debating right now. For you to contemplate. So I've gone to slide 3. For some of you, this may be a refresher. It's stuff that we talked about last year, but there are some new committee members. So I thought it would be helpful to ground everybody in what kind of exists today. And so there are 4 main types of guidance in the executive branch that we use to administer state government in general. So that includes administrative bulletins. Today, we're going to talk more specifically about Bulletin 5, which is our grant issuance and monitoring bulletin. But there are bulletins that exist for other things. So for example, Bulletin 3.5 is our other, I think, really big, important bulletin. And that guides how we procure and contract for services in the state of Vermont. There's also Bulletin 3.4, which guides how we do travel and expense reimbursement. So really, these bulletins lay out the parameters for how we administer these various items. So within my agency, there's the Department of Finance and Management. They're responsible for the budget and for the accounting system and the associated processes. So Finance and Management issues policies, including vision procedures. Vision is our accounting system. So these procedures tell our financial staff across state government how they should be using the accounting system. There are also policies that are on specific things like how do departments handle petty cash? How do they handle if a check is voided and comes back? What's the right process to do that? Today, we're going to talk about a new finance and management policy that we issued really in response to our discussions last year and because of updated federal guidance, which talks about our indirect rates. Then there are also executive branch directive memos. Those are memos that come directly from me as the Secretary of the Agency of Administration, and I think are designed to be for emerging issues that we want to kind of quickly get some guidance out to state government. I will issue a memo with directions. And so, for example, we recently, within the last 2 weeks, issued a directive memo to state government related to state compliance with the Americans with Disability Act accessibility rules. The federal government, I think about a year ago, updated those rules related to websites and what states need to do to come into compliance with accessibility standards. And so my office issued a directive with a plan of action across state government for how we will get into compliance. So that's just an example of when and why I would issue a directive memo. And then there's also human resources, personnel policies and procedures, and that really guides everything from performance management to classification, compensation, conduct, all sorts of things. Lots of detailed procedures there. Okay, so the next slide, slide 4, talks a little bit about administrative bulletins. And you can see on here, I've included a statutory reference. 3 VSA section 2222A2 that really directs the Secretary of Administration to issue general policy statements and general rules and regulations that would be applicable to the executive branch of state government to implement executive orders or legislative mandates. And so that's the authority that's given to my office in statute to issue these bulletins, policies, and procedures. The next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about Bulletin 5. So again, I'm trying to provide some overall context to the bill, to what exists now, and then we'll drill into the bill. So Bulletin 5 is our bulletin related to grant issuance and monitoring, and it establishes the general policy and standards for issuing and monitoring grant awards issued by the state of Vermont, both state, federally funded, and hybrid. We could have some agreements that are both state and federal dollars. This bulletin indicates that all grants must be issued, tracked, and monitored to ensure the proper use and protection of taxpayer resources in conformity with the law. Federal Uniform Guidance, which has a new name, Guidance of Federal Financial Assistance, which Jordan updated me on yesterday, in accordance with the terms of the grant. So as I said at the start of my testimony, we updated our Bulletin 5 on July 1st of 2024. And really, we did that for 2 main reasons. One, federal guidance was updated and became effective on October 1st. And so we knew we needed to make sure that our state policy and bulletin aligned with the federal guidance, because that is the law. But we also, after participating in testimony and discussions last year with this committee in Senate GovOps, as well as with some of our nonprofit partners, we felt it was very important to make sure that our Bulletin 5 addressed the concerns that we were hearing as part of the testimony and discussion last year. And so we worked hard, Jordan and his team of 2 people, it's Jordan and 1 other person, but working across state government to update Bulletin 5 to be able to incorporate what we heard for discussion last year. And we'll drill more into what that means, but wanted the committee to be aware of that. So as part of Bulletin 5, not only is it and I have a copy of it with me here today, but I also provided it to your committee assistant Autumn so that she could post it on your website. But it's a relatively lengthy technical document that really lays out a lot of the processes related to grants management. But in addition to that bulletin itself, there are associated procedures that accompany the bulletin that include templates for grant agreements, pre-award eligibility checklists, single audit review information, grant payment information, and now indirect rate information. So companion documents meant to really build this full compendium of guidance related to how we administer grants. So I've also included a link on the presentation, but Autumn has likely posted it so folks can go there for ease of access. So very specifically on the next slide, I've listed what were the things that were updated as part of our July 2024 update, which and we'll talk more about this. We clarified and expanded the indirect cost rate calculation language that was in Bulletin 5. And we also created a companion finance and management policy number 11 related to indirect cost rate proposal review. We updated the federal language within Bulletin 5 to reflect the guidance of federal financial assistance. So the updates that came from the federal government effective October of 2024, we made sure that our state bulletin aligned with that. We also took considerable effort to make the entire document more modern and accessible, and also a similar look and feel as Bulletin 3.5, so that users, as they look at, those are probably the two most common bulletins in state government, but they look similarly. So for ease of access of our financial staff and contract and grants managers across state government. And then we also updated all of the associated Bulletin 5 procedures that need to kind of move in lockstep with our overall bulletin. Part of the conversation that we had last year was about, I think, agencies and departments' use and adherence to Bulletin 5. And so I think we acknowledged in our testimony with the committee last year is that we had a need for training in this space. And so as part of our update of Bulletin 5, Jordan and his colleague have provided some statewide training related to the updates that were made to Bulletin 5 and the associated procedures. The idea really being to make sure that our financial staff and contracts and grant staff should really understand what the realm of possibility is and what the bulletin allows, and make sure that they have the opportunity to be kind of briefed in on the updates and also to be able to ask questions to make sure that they understand. I know that Jordan and Kim spend a lot of time also with kind of one-on-one communications with folks across the state as they work to administer grants. Another kind of, I think, pretty cool thing that the state has developed really in the last couple of years is what's called a continuous improvement network, which is a collection of state employees that have common interests in a topic. And I feel like the state, through our chief performance office and partners like some of the folks at Forest Parks and Recreation and across state government, have really built this network that's on teams where folks can ask questions that they may have as it relates to administering a grant. Any sort of question could come up, and I can see it because I'm a member of the team on my computer. And so I can see when questions pop up, they roll through my screen. It's actually really awesome to see the questions that are being asked, and then just the collegiality across state government as I see answers coming from everywhere, which is really like our experts are ourselves. And it's great to see the power leveraged across all agencies and departments. And so there is a contracts and grants communities of practice. That's where I see these notes really pop up every week, where folks are asking and answering questions. And there's also a state of Vermont subrecipient monitoring network, which is very similar, but a more specific focused team. And so I wanted to update you on our efforts to kind of try to level set across state government about our policies and procedures. So the next slide is a bar chart, which really just is meant to give you kind of a quick look at grants in Vermont. As of last year, we had roughly 12,000 active grants across state government that our agencies and departments are administering. As you know, and you can see on this slide, the graph reflects basically our federal funds that are issued as grants. It's from our schedule of expenditures of financial awards. And the orange bar is the non-subrecipient, the blue bar are the subrecipient grants. And what I think the key takeaway from this slide is you can see from 2018 moving into 2021, you can see our federal awards increasing, coinciding with the pandemic and the really huge infusion of federal dollars that came into the state. And you can see that leveling off in 22 and 23. And the update that I made to the slide from when I was here the last time is I'd say now federal funding is more uncertain as we continue to assess actions at the federal level to understand what will the real impacts be to Vermont. And it's really kind of too soon to know that, but we will likely know more about that when the US Congress finishes negotiating and debating the budget for next federal fiscal year. So more to come on that.
Is there reconciliation process starts like end of May?
What our sources tell us is that it's probably early to mid-May where we'll have a sense of what those impacts will be on Vermont. Why that will be challenging for all of us is that's historically when the legislature adjourns, but also when like the budget will have been well wrapped up. And we're on pace with our budget. As you know, the House passed it. Gosh, was it just last week? Time is really flying. But we are on pace with any normal year. But we will be finalizing the budget when potentially things could be changing at the federal level. We don't know yet, right? What will happen, but I'm sure, we're all vigilant about what may happen at the federal level, and how we will have to pivot. So not related to our topic today, but something for us all to be aware of.
Situational awareness for sure.
Yeah. The other thing, if you're interested, we have a website associated with the Agency of Administration called Spotlight, which is meant to be a transparency website. And we do have detailed listing of all of the grants that are executed in the state in a given year. Same for contracts. If you ever were interested in really diving into that data, it's there. Okay. So the next slide, slide 8, provides a little bit more information about indirect cost rates in Vermont state government and how we handle them now. So we follow the guidance for federal financial assistance as we are required to. And as part of that federal guidance, we are required to use one of the following 3 methods for federal subawards as it relates to indirect rates. And this is a refresher from last year. But the 3 options are the federally approved indirect cost rate or the federal de minimis rate, which is currently 15%. And why that is really important to understand is last year when I was talking to you, that was 10%. So the federal government allowed the de minimis to increase from 10 to 15% last year. And so that was, I think, a really critical part of this conversation. Or the third option is a rate negotiated with the state pass-through entity. And that's where our new finance and management procedure on indirect cost rates is important because it lays out some of the ways in which that can happen in terms of the negotiated indirect cost rate. So the de minimis rate is a federal rate. There's no Vermont specific de minimis rate. We follow the federal guidance. And Bulletin 5 allows state funded grants to draw indirects using one of those above methodologies. So really the important thing here is though these are federal requirements, our bulletin allows state funded grants or hybrid grants to use that same kind of methodology and options. And then I think everything else on this slide I've already discussed. So the next slide, slide 9, is prompt payment and payment terms. Again, a refresher from last year, but to make you aware of what is our current policy and practice, which is that payments to all invoices are to be made in 30 days of receipt of the invoice. And that is what's within our agency's guidance and detailed in Finance and Management Policy 5 payment terms. And so that is the expectation that payments are made in net 30. That's been in place going back to June of 2008. Understanding that sometimes, as you have heard, as I heard last year and I heard again this year, we don't always hit that target of net 30 days, hit that requirement of net 30 days. But in large part, the statistic that you see on this page is that from fiscal year 22 to 24, 97.8% of our grant payments across state government were made within 30 days. Does that mean that there aren't still challenges that are outside of that 30 days? No, you've heard testimony on that, and as have I. But I wanted to kind of let you know broadly, we are within that net 30 requirement. Understanding there are some areas that need to be addressed. We listened to the testimony from last week, and I know you had a few organizations, Lund, Jenna's Promise, that came in with some details of challenges that they experienced. And, we do have more details on that and are happy to follow up with those organizations if that's useful. But also wanted to talk about payment terms. I think you've discussed in the bill, part of the working group is looking at the ability to do advanced payments. So advanced payments are currently allowed per Bulletin 5. and federal guidance, but they are limited to the minimum amounts needed and should be made in amounts that minimize the time elapsing between the disbursement of the funds and the functions provided by the grant. And so this is detailed on page 34 of Bulletin 5, but it's meant like our goal is always to minimize the risk to taxpayers, either state or federal. And so when we talk about advanced payments, it is something that departments and agencies have the ability to do, but it is very narrow and prescriptive in terms of when it would be appropriate. And there is a risk assessment that occurs in order to kind of allow that as an option. And it's also, I would say, from a resource perspective, doing advanced payments requires more state resources than reimbursement based, only because you want to make sure that as you're advancing either state or federal money, that you're doing it in a way that minimizes that risk. And so departments and agencies really need to make sure that they're doing a thorough risk assessment for moving forward with that. But it is something that is possible and can happen. So I don't know if you want me to pause for questions. That's kind of an overview of what exists now and like what we updated and follow up to our discussions last year. What I have next is kind of a section by section considerations for the bill that you're debating.
Yeah, good idea. We'll take a stop for a second just to see if there's any questions from the table. Representative Nugent.
Thanks for coming in and your feedback on the bill. I have a few questions, sorry, different sections. As far as the percentage of grant payments that have been made within 30 days, is that percentage drawn from the total number of payments requests, the final version, or is that from the first invoice? So like when a nonprofit invoices the state, we heard testimony, a lot of times it gets sent back for various numbers of reasons, errors, a label isn't correct or something like that. And when you submit the invoice, the 30-day clock tends to start again. So I was wondering if if that percentage is of, which section of invoices.
Yeah, why don't I start the answer and then Jordan will have more to add because his team did this analysis, but essentially it's coming from our accounting system, how we got to that statistic. And maybe Jordan, why don't I hand it to you if that's okay?
It's the final invoice. So it's looking at the payments themselves from the system. So if someone submits something and they're missing backup documentation, or they charge indirects to equipment, which is unallowable, and there's something in there that needs a change, that's going to be, the versions are going to pile up if they do, and those are going to be counted as one when we're looking at this. So this is the acceptable submission versions, 97.2%. It's
And then my other question was, do you know how many nonprofits have taken advantage of that process in Bulletin 5 to if they need a higher indirect rate or could you talk about that process a little bit?
Yeah.
a rough number for just.
Do you want to join?
Yeah.
There's a chair right over there. You guys do a duet. Yeah.
And please introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Jordan Black Deegan.
That makes people look tiny.
I'm Jordan Black Deegan. I'm the statewide grant administrator, so I do a lot of this policy updating and writing, training, and I spend a large amount of time doing one-on-one work with grant administrators whenever issues pop up, either if it's with a federal partner and we're working with them to get things done, or with subrecipient or grantees. So kind of going both directions. Now I'm forgetting what the question is. I'm sorry. I'm moving over here.
Yeah,
How many take advantage?
Of the
Oh, okay.
negotiated indirect rate? Is
Yes.
that- Yeah.
So since the new policy 11 that we put up, which is the finance and management policy that I wrote last June that went live with the new version Bulletin 5, part of that policy has these reviewed rates now coming to finance and management so that we have a little bit of kind of oversight to see it and also to share it statewide. One of the issues that came up last year in the second testimony from a not-for-profit was that they got approved by one department and another department didn't accept it. And so one of our ways to kind of work with that is now departments can come to us and we can say, no, it's already been approved by HHS or, you know, AHS and AOT, you can use it without doing a review, without doing a process. So what we've seen now is 32. That's the number that I have in file. And I know because I had a meeting earlier this week with a department, there are other ones out there that are in the process. So that there are ones that have been coming in. One of the things that we've seen is that a lot of the larger not-for-profits in Vermont have federally approved rates. And once they have those, it's an annual or biannual, depending on if they do the extension process to get it re-upped. And that's happening at the federal level. For instance, Lund, who testified last week, they have a federally approved rate. We don't see that until it comes in and they provide a letter to us and that's it. Once we have a letter from the Fed saying this is their rate, we accept it. Everyone accepts it for both state and federal. But the ones that are coming to us for review for the state approval, there's only been 32 since then. And I've worked with, I think, 3 or 4 different departments on it. And I believe that we've gotten all the way to the finished letter with all of the people who have applied. So whether it's been, you know, a long process or short process, it has varied depending on what we receive initially, if they followed the steps correctly or if things were missing. We have gotten all the way there with all the ones in the past or are in the process of doing that. And then on the other side of things, there are also educations, you know, doing their own thing. They have different rules, different requirements, and that number is significantly higher than 32, but it's been a very ongoing process for a long time. So all of the school boards they're in a kind of an annual update process with that, so.
Anything else? Guess we'll go into the sections of the bill then.
Great. So page 11, and these are just items for your consideration. We've talked a lot about them already, so I don't have to belabor any of these points, but you know, section 1 of the bill really calls on the Secretary of Administration to include a uniform formula and approval process for all state-funded grants for an indirect. And so I think my main point here is that we do have that already in Bulletin 5, and then with Finance and Management Policy number 11, that exists and allows for indirect rates other than de minimis. Section 2, my next slide has to do with the prompt execution grant agreements and payments. So talking about the timing of execution, and I think you're going to hear some really valuable information from Forest Parks and Recreation after Jordan and I are done here. But the timing of execution, understanding the goal to execute as quickly as possible. We share that goal, especially, you know, when the legislature appropriates with the clear intent. I think there's for your consideration, a difference between a competitive grant where you have to have an application process and, you know, I don't think, and you'll hear more about this from Forest Parks and Recreation, to be able to execute a competitive grant within 30 days is not possible. So there's a difference, I think, between competitive and a pass-through grant. For example, to the food bank, you know, there's been a few years where there's direct, you know, appropriations to the Department for Children and Families for the food bank. So those situations, you know, I think that expectation may be more reasonable, but still 30 days is pretty quick when you look at what's going on at the kind of the end of the fiscal year, heading into the new fiscal year, and the work load on business offices and contracts and grants units at that time. The other, and this is one from Jordan, section 2A1B, verbal notice is not an audible form of communication. So should be written notice. And then prompt payment, I think we've already talked about what is the expectation and policy, which is the net 30 days. And then, you know, other parts of section 2, so 2B2 talks about if a granting agency is unable to issue prompt payment, it's requiring the agency to submit in writing to the Agency of Administration about why it was late. So for your consideration, we would have concerns about that additional burden of a written explanation for the delay that will place on the department and potentially further lengthening the time needed to administer grants, something for you to consider, as well as in section 2C, which requires reporting for the Agency of Administration, creating an online form and various reporting metrics, concern about the administrative burden of doing that. And like, what's the goal of the reporting? Wanting to make sure that we are clear on that. And then the last section, 2D, the Secretary of Administration per statute, as we discussed, we issue bulletins. And so we do update our bulletins as needed and as relevant. And so you saw that in July of 2024 with Bulletin 5 related to grants. We also, since I've been with the Secretary of Administration office, I think we've issued 2 updates to Bulletin 3.5 related to contracting. So these are living, breathing documents that we want to make sure in general stay relevant to state government and how we manage programs. So then section 3, which is the working group on the state grant processes, considerations for you is, and we talked about a lot of this last year as well, as the membership of the committee. I think now the way that it's currently drafted, I think there's 2 members of the executive branch, which I think is positive, but want to make sure that if there is a working group that moves forward, that we have a balance maybe between executive branch administration folks and the various community partners or legislative appointees. Making sure we share the vision of what are the goals of the working group and having that be clearly articulated. I think a lot of what's listed now does exist currently in bulletin. So making sure that we are specific if we move forward with the working group and what we want it to do. And then some of these are just more minor notes for your consideration, like contracts and grants are 2 different things. They're related, but they're 2 different. I think the working group pulls in contracts, but the rest of the bill is really focused on grants. So I'm not, if that's intentional, like we should make sure that we are including all of the relevant stakeholders because it's a different issue, different state employees and probably different outside of state government folks would want to weigh in there. It also pulls out the Agency of Human Services specifically. AHS, I was the CFO there not too long ago. It's got 6 departments in the Secretary's office, and though they adhere to Bulletin 5, and they actually have an internal audit group there that helps drive some of the grants administration at the agency, but they do still have each department is different. So something for you to consider in terms of this language. And then we've talked about some of these other items in terms of the payment options are really informed by the risk assessment. We've talked about that and what our options are. State and federal indirect rates are currently the same. They're in lockstep. So, and then the resource constraints of the Agency of Administration, though I have departments underneath me, the Secretary's office is really small, in ways that I didn't anticipate until, well, now I'm sitting as the secretary, but when I came as deputy, it's, you do kind of like direct state government in many ways, but our actual resources within the agency are small but mighty, but something to consider as we, talk about reporting requirements and monitoring, something to consider.
Right. Any questions?
Yeah, I have
Waters Evans?
thanks. So it sounds like you've said like a few times as you were talking that some of the things that are being asked for in the bill are things that already exist, like in the bulletins or in policy. So can you speak to, it sounds like you've made some changes to try and solve some of those problems, but can you speak to how those policies or the information or, the procedures set out in the bulletin are not enforced? That's the wrong word I'm looking for, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
How they're
Heather adhered to make sure there's
Early.
compliance.
Yeah. And how they're kind of brought forward to the people who are supposed to be implementing them, and then what the follow through is on how that works. And if there are improvement processes that exist already to make them work better, just.
Yeah, I'll give my high level thoughts and then I think Jordan can drill into some of the details. I think the first step, and we talked about it, is the training that we've been rolling out to make sure people are aware of what's in the bulletin and that they're responding accordingly. Every year we go through the single audit process that audits us on adherence essentially to our policies, both state and federal. And so there is like that kind of inherent every year review of our adherence to our policies. And then maybe Jordan can add his thoughts.
Yeah, so the single audit's a great one. It obviously is looking at all of the biggest programs and then a selection of the smaller programs. So it doesn't look at every single program, but it does give us an idea of, even if it looks at one program in a department, if they have an issue, it normally, for Kim and I in our group, that normally tells us that's probably an issue in all of the programs in that department or all of the programs that group is handling. And so it's first of all enforced by the feds that we address it and that we can show to them that we fixed it. But it also lets us know that, you know, maybe we have to go and take a larger look at these things. There's federal audits as well. Our federal federal partners audit their programs regularly. We have 3 federal audits ongoing right now. We had 3 federal audits wrap up last year from 3 different federal agencies and departments. And all 3 of the ones last year wrapped up relatively quickly. So we were able to look at what they've said since then. 2 of them were clean. 1 of them had some concerns, and we've been able to look at and address those in the past. I think it's been about 6 months since that one wrapped up. So those are good ways to look at it. And then as far as getting it out, Secretary Clark did send a memo out when the bulletin went live, letting everyone know that the bulletin, the 3 bulletin procedures, I think we had 5 other documents, 6 finance and management policies and 2 forms, all updated at the same time to go live. And Kim and I did do 2 trainings on those through that new community of practice group. The first one was indirect specific. It was an hour-long training and followed by an hour-long Q&A. It was pretty heavily focused on the de minimis rate change. That was where a lot of the questions were, but it was on all indirects. And then there was a bulletin 5 and uniform guidance to guidance for federal financial assistance update training that we did, which was 2 hours. It was recorded, and the Q&A from it, we have written with the responses in there. We had someone who took notes for us and recorded both the questions and our responses. So that's all available resources, even if someone didn't make the training. I went back and looked before today to check. We had 186 state employees at the uniform guidance to guidance for federal financial assistance update. So we had a really good turnout for, I believe, every department. I was going through trying to figure it out, but I believe we had, at least one person from every department in the state present at that training who works with grants, who was there to sit through that grant training, hear the Q&A questions, or even ask questions. So. Yep.
Anything else from the table? Well, thank you so much. That was very thorough, and the 101 was definitely helpful as well. So I appreciate it. All right, next on the list, I have Ashley Blair. Sorry.
That chair, Jordan.
Oh, you need the chair.
Yeah. Yeah.
But hello, good morning, everyone. So for the record, my name is Lauren Pyle. I am the Outdoor Recreation Grants Manager for the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation within the Agency of Natural Resources. And I am here today to share a little bit more about what we do on our side of things, administering grant programs. So I'm going to pull my slides up here for you all, just because I like to walk through them, but to be able to share the day-to-day pieces that we pull together for our grant administration. So this is specifically a computer slide that wants to go. Here we go. The grant agreement process. So I work, as I said, within FPR. And just to give you an understanding of how all of our grant making comes together, we run as a department 7 different state funded grant programs. Currently, we have 109 active community grants out to businesses, municipalities, nonprofits. The total's over $20 million. And then in addition to that, there are another 12 federal grant programs that FPR administers that have 71 current subrecipients with, again, another 7.3 million. And that is just what is active in this moment. So I run the outdoor recreation programs within that, which is almost half of this portfolio. So it's myself and some grant specialists, and I work on the programmatic side of things, which is that for me, what that means is I interface directly with the municipalities, the nonprofits, and the businesses that are applying for grants, and then I support them when they become grantees throughout the entire process. So everything from answering questions about like, what grant do I apply for, to what are the requirements for application, going through that coaching process, writing grant agreements, to ultimately helping to process reimbursements, amendments, and close out those projects so we can call them a success. And the main state funded grant program that I run and share is the VOREC Community Grant Program. So I administer this program. VOREC is the Vermont Outdoor Recreation Economic Collaborative. This is a grant program that has been funded through a series of one-time appropriations. We've done 4 rounds in the past, each of them successfully larger than the previous. But cumulatively, we're looking at $11 million in state awards to 84 different grantees since 2019. And this program really is invested in helping to grow outdoor recreation economies. And so that's everything from like growing businesses, increasing participation in outdoor recreation activities, to really boosting outdoor recreation assets like repair, improvement, replacement, promoting stewardship, and overall promoting health and wellness. And so it funds all kinds of stuff, everything from construction to replacement, renovation, planning, which is huge. It funds marketing, it funds programming, and actually organizational capacity building. So really broad programmatic portfolio. And the most recent grant round for this, we call it the 2023 grant round because that's when the applications launched, was in fall of 2023. And in that grant round, between when the applications opened in October of 2023, we ended up going through and selecting 51 projects out of that competitive application pool, and got them almost all into grant agreements before the end of that fiscal year. So it was a really rapid turnaround, and they fund, what you're seeing on this slide here is like the 4 categories of projects that they get into. As I said, we call it implementation, or often those construction, the doing things part, construction, marketing, signage, planning. We also, this past year, had a flood recovery track, which was very specifically intended to help repair resources. This is from the 2023 floods. And then there was an outdoor equity track. And what you're seeing on the map here, this is, if you really want to zoom in and see it, we have the live map on our website. This is all of the VOREC community grants projects that have been funded since 2019. So as you can see, and they're color coded by year. So if you're wondering what that is by year. And there are even more under there. But we funded all across the state through this program. And so it was 51 projects that we moved forward with grant agreements last year. And I just want to walk you through the process of what happened and what did we do. And so this is a slide. I actually share this with our grantees when I do trainings with them to help them understand that from when we tell them that they're selected for grants, there's a lot of steps that happen between when they're selected to when they get that executed grant agreement. And I'm going to walk through each of these with you. So thinking about this 2023 process, from the time that they were selected, right, the applications come in, they're scored by independently. We have conversations around the qualitative and quantitative components. They're signed off on by Commissioner Fisco. Then we say, yeah, you're selected to move forward. And we tell them that. Generally, we want to get that all out in a really concentrated period of time, because if not, they talk to each other and instantly, I've had ones where like I send the email out within an hour, I'm still sending notices and somebody else is saying, hey, my colleague got this back. So we send those out really quickly, all in a bunch together, both the acceptances as well as the declines. We also then at that point collect what we call compliance documentation. We have this additional information that we need, and we don't ask for it during the application process to help reduce the administrative and application burden on the applicants, right? These are things that you only need if you're going to move forward. And so this might be things like a new W-9. If they haven't been received a grant from the state before. This is things like an updated certificate of insurance that meets the state's requirements as outlined in attachment C1. This is things like there's a risk assessment questionnaire, as well as a certificate of good standing for Act 154 for the state. And so we give them all this opportunity to say, hey, give us your stuff. Like, you've got a couple weeks, get it back to us. And then we start to process that compliance information. This is also the time where we are asking for grantees to fill in the blanks, because within our applications, right, we have required uploads, we have other pieces, but we start to realize that we have projects that came in that maybe had like almost everything they needed, but not quite. And so we start asking for that additional information to fill in the gaps. And like common examples of that might be things like we get hand-drawn maps that are not very easy to tell where the project is, what's happening, where is that work, who are the landowners. And so if we get one of those, we need an updated map. We need them to invest that time and resources in developing a map that meets the requirements that we outline in our application checklist. But oftentimes, if they're almost all the way there, that doesn't stop them from being considered. Other common pieces are landowner permissions. All of the grants that I administer fund projects both on private lands and public lands. And for private lands, that means that they have to submit landowner permission from every single one of the landowners where the work's going to happen. And that landowner permission, the purpose of that is twofold. First is that we want to make sure that they, as the applicant, have permission from the landowners to do the work. But then there's also a commitment from the landowner to keep that resource and asset open to the public for the duration of it, like a measured period of time that depends on the project. So that could be as simple as 1 year if they're grooming snow for, say, cross-country skiing or snowmobiling, up to like a 25-year easement or more for a permanent structure, such as a restroom or a large engineered bridge. We just want to make sure if we're putting public investment in these resources that the public can get it. And it's not uncommon within our applications that we will get, there were 10 landowners involved and we'll get 8 of them in the application process. And it's not until we really dig in with them that we realize that there were 2 missing. And this additional documentation, the compliance documentation, this additional resources can take anywhere, last year it took anywhere from 1 day to 6 weeks to get this from grantees. Because we generally send them a whole list, this is what we need. And that was the time period that they got back to us with. Sometimes even while that is still happening, we then proceed to reviewing those compliance documentation or those compliance documents. So that includes like a debarment check at the federal and state level, as well as reviewing what we call the risk assessment questionnaire, which is a form that our business office has put together that helps to assess the financial viability of this. Are they a low, medium, or high risk grantee? And to do that, I have to put together project summaries, which then go to our business office that they review, they come back to us, and then we actually factor in their risk considerations into the development of their grant agreement, because there are different provisions based on the level of risk. So after that happens, we're then at the point where like we've got the materials that we need. We start making a scope of work for the grant agreement. And this is really the bulk of the time that we put in with our grantees for this program. And again, that can be anything as quick as a day to up to more than 6 weeks. Because what we are doing is our staff on the grants program side, we take the application packages, which are sometimes in excess of 100 pages, and we try to distill it down into a couple of paragraphs of what the accountable scope of work is, what the metrics are that they're going to need to report on, and what the deliverables are at the end of the grant. So we have a lot of synthesizing that we need to do. But because of that, there's often back and forth where we'll say, okay, this is how we read it. Grantees, do you agree? Or there'll be pieces where they put it in and they'll say, well, we're going to do culvert work. That's great. That's what you put in your application. That's what the ranking committee approved. Wonderful that you're doing culvert work. How many culverts? Where are they? How big are they? Like, we want to put that into the agreement so that there's this clear understanding of like, what does success look like? And that's often like a multiple back and forth piece, depending on how much information we got right up front with the grant agreements in the original applications. And this often includes one-to-one meetings. I've met with boards. I've met with town staff. I've met with collaborations of partners, phone calls, as they're trying to figure this out back and forth. Once we land on the final draft, there's sometimes an additional step that's involved. That the timing is sort of up to, it just depends where it hits in the cycle. Many nonprofits that we work with, as well as many towns, will wait to approve the final grant agreement by either a board meeting or a select board meeting. And so just depending on when the draft hits and when the next meeting is, it could be anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. Then we're in the home stretch. This is the part that generally happens really quickly. So at the very end, once the grantee says, yes, this draft of the grant agreement looks good to us, we confirm and agree with it. We run through a final quality review, looking for things like grammar, double checking, does the attachments names, are they all in the right places? We sometimes do legal review for some of our grants, specifically if it's a new project. This happened a lot with the VORC Community Grant Program, is that we were getting proposals for projects we had never funded before as a department. And so we're like, how do we write in, as an example from us, how do we write in a provision in a grant agreement that we're funding a collaboration? Because we only fund really, like, we have one grantee, but they're chosen because of their 6 partners who are all going to get paid out of this grant. How do we write in language to the grant that includes that says they don't have to put that out for bid, because these are core partners on the grant? So we worked with our legal counsel within FPR to determine that language, to figure that out. So that's kind of a big piece there. And then after that, we have that final business office processing and review, which can be anywhere from 2 to 7 days. They're checking to the final compliance documents, anything that's missing, they're flagging, setting up them as vendors within our financial processing system Vision. They're doing all the final checks, and then they send it out for signatures. And the signature piece could be really fast if we have a grantee that's really responsive to email, or it could take up to 4 weeks. So generally those agreements are signed by the grantees first, and then it's almost always within 24 hours that Commissioner Fixco follows that signature. And so that's the process overall. And some of the really influencing factors on this are when we think about, like, well, when are we asking for this information and how long does it take? One of the biggest things that influences that period of time is the applicant capacity. How quick are they to respond to email or to phone calls or to other pieces? I work with a lot of all volunteer-led projects who might be like the volunteer trail committee or the volunteer rec committee with a town, or it is an all volunteer nonprofit. And so sometimes it just takes longer for those. It's really different from those high capacity organizations that have professional grants managers on staff. That's a huge piece. As well as, like, we're trying to do this careful balance of how much we ask in the application versus how much we ask, that everybody has to give us, versus like how much we need in to only to consider getting funded from that. Another consideration that we sit within, like, our ranking committees discuss this all the time, is the value of funding really good projects that are important versus really perfect proposals. And there are a lot of good projects that we fund that don't have perfect proposals. They have those hand-drawn maps. They're missing the landowner permissions, but substantively, it is an important project. It is valued. It's going to achieve our programmatic goals. And so we help to provide a lot of technical support and coaching during that grant agreement development phase to help them get to that perfect place, but we don't make them start there. We also want to allow for change through this, through the process, from when they apply. We have grantees who are continuing to pursue permitting requirements. They're continuing to investigate historical review requirements. They're continuing to work with professional planners and designers. And they'll sometimes come back to us to say, or they'll be getting more quotes. From when they applied to when they're ready to do a grant agreement, our plans have changed. You know, instead of doing 6 culverts, we're going to do 4 now. We need to reroute the trails because we just got the wetland delineation in. We don't want to go through the wetland. They want to do the right thing. And so we want to allow for them to make those changes. Or what has happened a lot actually in this past year as a result of both the 2023 and the 2024 flooding events is that the budget has changed, right? Like the cost of gravel is significantly different. So they thought they were going to be able to do 1.5 miles, and now they're going to be able to do 1 mile within the same amount of funding because we award every penny that we've got. We don't have anything left to be able to add to it. And so we often let them scale back to still achieve that. Some of them need more technical support than others. And this is technical support both on like, how do we write that contractual language, as well as like, I provide a lot of technical support of like, this is how we do track changes in a Word document to be able to get it back to us. Or this is how you can do it that side. So it's a whole range of pieces that we provide. And then one of my pieces coming into this, so before coming to FPR, I've been with them for about 1.5 years. I spent my career sitting on the other side of the table. I was the one receiving grants within my day-to-day operations. And one of the things that we've talked about is like, we want to tell them as quickly as they can so they can start planning, right? Like we don't want to sit on an application for 9 months before we tell them like, okay, we've got your stuff, you're ready to go. Like we want to tell them as soon as possible that they're going to be moving forward, because for many of our projects, because of Vermont's climate and weather, right? Like summer is when the work can start. And so they have to start planning in advance well before they get the grant agreement. You know, for these groups, we told them at the end of February, like you're getting a grant, we're going to go into grant agreement phase. You've been selected, you're moving forward. Go ahead and start planning for it. So they're starting to hire temporary staff. They're looking into contractors. They're doing bidding processes. They don't sign any contracts till after they have a grant agreement. But they're doing that planning phase so that when that grant agreement comes in, they are ready to roll, which is what they're excited for and what is really important to set them up for success. Otherwise, we have to really extend our grant periods in a different way. So we want to tell them with as much lead time as possible rather than like once everything is perfect and ready. And that's what we've been thinking about. And so that was the general process. I want to just like kind of break down one of the grants that happened that we received last year, so you can think about it as that individual case study. So one of those 51 grants that we got was a small, all volunteer led nonprofit. They manage a network of trails on private lands down in Windsor County, and they had flood recovery work is what they submitted for. And so that included upsizing culverts, because that part of our flood recovery efforts were not just like fix it, but build it back better, right? So if you had a small culvert, like let's upsize it so next time the water can go through in a better way, so that it prevents future damage in the event of future high rainfall events. But they were going to upsize culverts. They were going to do a lot of regrading. And this was a big ask. It was $116,000 for an all volunteer led organization. And part of that ask was an excavator. They wanted to purchase an excavator. If you don't know, the state has very strong restrictions about equipment purchases related to grants. Like if you buy a piece of equipment with a grant, it will forever, for the durable life of that asset, only be used for those grant purposes. So for this case, buying an excavator to do flood recovery work means the excavator could then forever only be used for flood recovery work. Our ranking committee decided that that was not a good use of state funds. Because it's just not, it's not what the intention was. And so instead, the ranking committee said, let's give them partial funding. So that they can contract out the excavator work. They don't have to deal with it. And for this small nonprofit, talking to them afterwards, they didn't even know about the equipment restrictions, even though we had tried to put that in the application materials, they weren't aware of that. And so we were like, let's contract it out. And so at the end of February, which was right on time for our deadline, we told them, you're going to get a grant. You've been selected to move forward. We need those compliance documents. It took them not quite 2 weeks to get those pieces back to us. And then again, it took us another couple of weeks to get those risk assessments completed. Because while this is happening, this is actually 51 simultaneous projects going in that are all going at the same time. So in early April, we had the risk assessment completed. And then from early April to mid-June, we were on that scope revision process. because of that partial funding by the ranking committee to be good stewards of state funds, they had to revise their budget. They had to go back out and say, okay, well, what is the amount that we can get? Like, can we bid this out? How do we rebuild our budget? We're actually supporting them of trying to understand how they could claim administrative funds as an all volunteer nonprofit that doesn't have any staff. We were walking them through that process, that they were trying to figure that out. So they had to give us a new work plan, new maps, those things. And they still were missing some of the details. So we kept having to go back to them saying, we need more information. Like, we need this to be more concrete, just other than like your vision of all the plans. We had a lot of one-to-ones meetings with them, phone calls, some group meetings, lots of email back and forth. And then ultimately we landed on needing more accurate maps. And their original maps that they submitted were pretty good in the grand scheme of things. This was the original map that we got from them. You can see their trail network. You can see different location sites. There's all kinds of colors and stars, and it's a good enough map to start. But one of the critical pieces that missing was the landowner permission. So we had to go through multiple rounds of revision to get to the final map. And what I've blacked out there are actually just the individual names of the landowners that are on there. Because when they first gave us this updated version, when they put the overlay of who the landowners were, you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of stars here in the middle section that ended up moving. Because what they realized is they actually couldn't get landowner permission for those landowners. They had a verbal promise that the landowners like, yeah, it'll be fine, but we're not going to sign anything. And for us as an organization, as an entity, we can't fund that. We need to have that signed landowner permission to be good stewards of the funds. And so we had a lot of back and forth about like, how can we get the landowner permission? What support can we provide? How can we revise this project again? And that's really what they had to do, is like this final second revision. And all through this, we had this turnaround of anywhere from, usually it was 5 to 8 days, because they're all volunteer. But once they landed on their final revision, within 3 days, we had it to the business office. It was turned back out for them for signature. And really the big delay on getting it signed was their timing, right? Like they're logging into their email to be able to do that. And so for these ones, with all of our VORAC community grants, like that specific example, it took them 117 days from start to finish, from when we told them to when it was executed. But across the whole portfolio that we had last round, our average was 98 days. And one thing I haven't hit on with this is that this whole process, as I said, those 51 grantees, this is being run by myself and 1 half-time staff last year. Was our capacity, as well as we had 2 staff in the business office who were helping to support on that end, and they were really quick on this. So it was a high volume of grants that were all coming in happening simultaneously, as well as I had over 60 active grants that were still doing amendments, reimbursements, reporting at the same time. So moving as fast as we can, and we did still actually meet our original plan timelines for these. And we've been sitting and thinking about this, like, well, what would happen if we couldn't do this process? Like this coaching, this technical support that we provide, and like, what would be our options then? And for us, we've sort of been thinking about it, like option number 1, increase the application burden on the applicants so that everybody has to give us all the documents up front, including probably multiple asks, because things like certificates of insurance, every time that policy renews, we need a new one. And so many of them for applicants renew January 1st. We have fall deadlines on purpose because that's when they can do the applications. So like we'd immediately have to ask for them again, but it would increase the burden on the applicants, whether they were funded or not. It would prevent us from funding the project like we did. Like there are a lot of great projects that we just would not be able to say yes to if we had to do that. Or we'd have to spread out that notification time so that they wouldn't have the lead time for planning, or that they wouldn't all learn at once, just because we can't do that. We'd have to do like one at a time, or just spread out that piece so that they don't have that lead time, was really what we had kind of sat with about our options. So that is what I do in this side of things.
All right, any questions?
It's percolating, yeah.
Okay, percolate away. Yeah. Our water zones.
Thanks. So I've heard a couple of people say that, and including yourself, that like the process is kind of unpredictable timeline wise, right? So putting a restriction on when you can and should be distributing the money, like it doesn't always work. So I wonder what you think about adjusting the expectation. Rather than trying to cram everything into like a 30-day period, in order to still create, I think what we're trying to do, which is a predictable, steady system, accepting that there are variables within that. Like, what would be a good time period then if you, I know you're not bound to this, but do you know what I'm saying? Like, instead of saying, okay, 30 is too small, if there are all these different things, like what would be a reasonable time period that would help people with their budgeting and with their projects and maybe.
Yeah, it's a great question and one that I can't speak to across the state.
Of course.
Every grant program is a little different. Every capacity is different across different teams. There are all those pieces. I will say for this particular program, we had a posted timeline on our website that says this is when applications are due, this is when selection is going to happen, this is when grant agreement development is going to happen, and this is when you're going to be allowed to start. And we met our timelines as promised. That was actually the biggest thing for us, is that we made sure we met those timelines. And so I plan those timelines. As I said, I run multiple grant programs, or I have 2 rounds that are happening right now. And our goal is, like, I plan those timelines based on what we're anticipating to be realistic so that they can accurately plan. And so that's based on like the amount of funding I have, the number of grantees that we're expecting, the capacity, all those pieces. So that would be what we do, is to publish a timeline and then hold ourselves accountable to it. But like, we set that custom timeline.
Is that a common practice? Or do you?
I can't say across the state. So I've been with FPR for about 1.5 years. I'm still learning a lot about the other grant programs across the state, but it's not an uncommon piece. And I actually inherited a lot of these templates from predecessors.
Brett Nugent? Not related.
Do you have a sense of how many grants that you manage that the work has to start before the grant is executed, or how often that happens?
It varies based on the program. So 2 of the main programs that I run are federal programs where that is absolutely and explicitly prohibited by the federal government. So as much as they would love to start work early, I have confirmed multiple times with my program officers that those are not allowed. So they have to wait for those. For our state funded grants, that was actually one of the special things about the flood recovery track, is that they were allowed to have started before, because we knew that there was emergency response that happened day of. It was actually a specific grant track that was designed to allow for work that was already in process. For the other ones, it's a mix, of the pieces of like, they are always eager to start early. And also, though, through this process, like, one of the things I constantly get to remind grantees of is like, remember, you need to complete your permitting before you start. Right? Remember that you need to do this. And like, I check in with them, have you done this yet? And they're like, oh, we didn't yet. And so that checks piece helps them to ensure that they're following proper procedure. So in terms of how many, I don't have that estimate, but I do know like they're always eager. And also, like, many times we actually plan our cycle times based on like trying to hit the field seasons when they would be doing the work. I don't have a grant application process that runs in the summer, because that's when my community is in the field. They don't have time to apply and they need the money ready before the field season begins.
So does that, so it sounds like potentially if there's a delay in the process, it could delay the work that your department wants to have done also.
It could. We've like what happened last year with some of the VORIC community grant programs. We ended up having like some of the grants that were there. We had confirmed that we wanted to start June 1st with them. And some of them, like the one that was there, that's a flood recovery grant. So they were allowed to go backwards an indefinite amount, but we had wanted to start at a certain deadline. When we were getting close to that point and we weren't there yet, we had a conversation with the business office. I know that like my division director was involved and many other people. And we said, you know what, we're in the grant agreement development phase. We can still let them start work when we were planned. We'll allow for pre-award expenses back to the date that was originally planned, knowing that this is, for the handful that we had that didn't make that deadline, it was all for extenuating circumstances. So we said, yes, you can go ahead and get started with reimbursable work. And we just wrote it into their grant agreements as an eligible pre-award expense.
Go for it. Yeah. No, let's keep firing away.
Thanks for your, so when it comes to, so you were talking about volunteer based organizations, which, you know, I think that's probably has a separate set of issues versus those that are employee based or professional.
Mhm.
I'm curious, like the percentage of grants that you give out that are totally out of the blue that you're you know, because I think you might have mentioned that competitive grants felt like that 60 days or 30 days was possible, I think was what Sarah said, but I'm wondering like how many of those grants are completely new and hard to anticipate versus ones that are renew regularly but are competitive, you know, periodically, that kind of thing.
Yeah, almost all the grants that I run are competitive one-time grants. I think within one of the federal programs, we have a consistent year-over-year funding piece for snow grooming. But almost all the rest of them are brand new grants and brand new projects every time.
Which is different than a lot of the other agencies, I think.
So I mean, that's what we do. I would say there's two other legislatively defined grants that I help to administer that are pass-through grants to two different entities. And like those are really cut and dried. Like those are very simple as compared to the community and competitive grant process. You know, they still have their own checks and balances. You know, they have to do their budgets. One is VAST, the Vermont Association of Snow Travelers, like then their budget gets approved by the Governor's Snowmobile Council. So like they have to have that budget approval before I can write the grant agreement. But as soon as that happens, it's a very different process overall.
Anything else from the committee? No. Thank you so much for that.
And I have a small piece too. So hi, for the record, I'm Ansley Bloomer.
Oh, sorry.
I'm the Director of Finance and Administration for Forest Parks and Recreation. So I oversee the business office and the financial aspects of the work that grants programs do. So I'll just share a little bit about our grants team, who we are, what we do. So you heard from Lauren, who's on the programmatic side of things. Again, I'm on the financial side. So my team oversees grants finances, the monitoring, and the grant, ultimately the state funded grant payments, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about the FPR grants team, so Forest Parks and Recreation, FPR. The grants team that we have at Forest Parks and Recreation is stellar. We have probably one of the best grants teams in the state. They're smart, they're forward thinking, they're really some of the best. And they do a really, really fantastic job with a pretty really robust workload. We currently have a grants portfolio of $70 million, about 50 million of that's federal, 21 million is state funded. And then we receive about roughly 400 to 500 grant subrecipient payments. So these invoices that are coming through for reimbursement annually. That fluctuates greatly based on the programs that we have at any given time. But we'll say 400. We had about 393, not about 393 last year. We're at about 350 for this year. So I'm going to talk a little bit, if you want to talk a little bit about the life cycle. What does that mean, a grant payment? So ultimately, I've identified about 5 steps generally for a grant payment. So this is the way it works for Forest Parks and Recreation. I suspect it's very similar for other departments and agencies, but I'm really speaking specifically for FPR. And a grantee has a reimbursement request. So they email our programs team. The programs team then takes that invoice, takes a look at it, makes sure it has all the checks and balances, I's dotted, T's crossed, and then sends it on to the business office for processing. The business office gets it, does their second layer of checks and balances, make sure the coding, so where it's going to hit on our books is correct, and then sends it to our secretary's office, who then enters it into Vision, that accounting software, and then ultimately checks get put out the door or ACHs get transmitted, whatever happens with ACHs, those also get out the door. So that's the full life cycle. And we've identified, so first and foremost, with this being a very manual process, the first step is an email. We don't really have a way of tracking exactly when we get a subrecipient grant request because it's just an email. So right now we don't have a structure really baked in to know exactly when this all starts, that 30 days. It's an email. But we've identified, generally speaking, looking back at the last fiscal year, it takes us about 10 days, soup to nuts, start to finish, steps 1 through 5 to get a grant payment in and back out. For the business office, once it actually comes to the business office, we're looking at generally 2 days. So really, really quick turnaround. That said, and Jordan spoke to it a little bit too, there are a lot of places that we can hit a snag, and we absolutely do hit snags in this process. Some of the things that might come up, for example, someone's on vacation for, I don't know, 14 days. That's 14 days that an invoice is potentially sitting in an inbox. Also talked about this too, W-9. So if a vendor no longer has an active W-9, we need a new W-9, go back and forth on that. Another thing that we actually see quite a bit is a vendor or a grantee submits an invoice with an address that's different than what's on the record in Vision. Those two things don't match up, so we have to send it back. Sometimes there's miscoded invoices as well. Another thing that happens quite often is they'll submit their invoice and it should have programmatic reporting to accompany it. It's a requirement. We just have the invoice. We need to go back to the drawing board because we don't have all the materials to really submit that grant payment. Or we get an invoice today that's dated March 15th. It's been 3 weeks or however many days that is, and it's just being submitted now. Obviously, with this very manual process, there's obviously a lot of room for human error. And I hate to say these words, it gives me like tremors in my soul, but turnover is a very real thing. One person's gone and it breaks down a system. Hate those. That's the worst. And then there's another thing that happens every fiscal year, and that is that there is a pause. At the end of the fiscal year, the books are reconciled, and there is a point in time where we don't actually have spending authorities on some of our funds. And so we have to wait for what's called a pause or a freeze on those funds. And the last thing I'll say, and this is for FPR especially, Forest Parks and Recreation in May, every year we bring on 450 seasonal staff. We set up 56 state parks to operate. All of a sudden we go from a 0 to 100 real quick on our workload. So the seasonality of our work specifically really intensifies in the summer months. And that certainly can have an impact on how fast we're going to be able to process something. And I will say, besides the last, I don't think we actually ever had an invoice not make it through because of the busyness. Our team is amazing. But I would say every single one of those other scenarios happened last year. So they're very real. So for your consideration, I'll start off by saying that our best guess last year, 95% of our grants got through in a 30-day window. Again, when you hit those snags, and some of them are completely out of our control, there's definitely opportunity for those to happen. So for your consideration, one of the things that'd be really challenging for us is really that tracking. So when things hit Vision, there is a clear record, but when we actually get a grant reimbursement request, that is really truly an email. We don't have a system to track 30 days right now. So that would be a really challenging thing, and also would definitely would be an extra burden to the team. They'd have to stand up some type of tracking mechanism for that. I see the other thing that really concerns me is that, again, I'm just thinking about that, like someone just comes back from vacation, they have an invoice, they need to get it out the door like now. I feel like a 30-day turnaround really encourages like forcing us to pay quickly versus accurately. There definitely can be instances where things are pushed through just in spite of not hitting that 30-day window. And then I would say another thing, just especially about my team, my team is so busy and so amazing, and they're thriving and they're excelling. And this just feels like a lot of extra work for a team that's already really hitting the mark 99.9% of the time. And the other thing I really want to share, because this is really exciting, is on the horizon, we have an enterprise resource planning system, ERP. I hope if you haven't heard about it, it's a really exciting thing that's coming our way really soon. It's a new system that will replace Vision, it'll replace VTHR, which is going to alleviate so many of these pain points. I've seen a demonstration of the ERP system, and in a lot of ways, it puts the grantees or the vendors in the driver's seat. It's bringing us to current modern times with our financial system, basically. So that's really exciting. In the next couple of years, we will have a system that'll look a lot different and act really different for our grantees as well. So that is all that I have. Any questions?
Questions from the table? Okay, well, thank you very much. We appreciate your presentation, and we'll reach out if we have further questions. So now Rebecca Washburn, please.
I was only here as backup just in case. there were
Okay, so you have
questions.
nothing to report to us. Does anyone have any questions? You're with Lands Administration and Recreation? In FPR.
Yes, yeah,
Yes,
so
so any
I oversee the
additional.
grant making work, and if there were things that Lauren did not
Okay.
have short tenure, I was here to provide any backup.
Great, well, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll be taking some more consideration of this bill, and if you had anything else to add, don't hesitate to reach out to us.
So much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
that.
So I believe we will be shifting gears. We have legislative council here, and we'll be talking about charters and getting a charter 101 since we are the charter committee.
Definitely know how to clear a room. Good morning, everyone. Tucker Anderson, Legislative Counsel. I was invited here this morning to talk about municipal charters and do Charters 101, which I suppose is all the questions you ever had about charters, but were too afraid to ask. So I am prepared to answer any questions you have. Otherwise, I can start from the top, work my way through charter authority, the charter process, the General Assembly's role, and we can answer questions as I kind of roll along. Does that sound like an okay plan?
It's good to me.
Stellar. All right. Starting from the top, municipal chartering and the incorporation of units of government is a constitutional power that is solely granted to this branch of government. The supreme legislative power is vested, of course, in the legislature. That's from Section 2 of Article 2, of the Vermont Constitution. Section 6 states that one of the inherent powers, express powers, of the Vermont General Assembly is to grant charters of incorporation, subject to the provisions of Section 69 of Chapter 2 of the Vermont Constitution, to constitute towns, boroughs, cities, and counties. Section 69 of the Vermont Constitution states that no charter of incorporation shall be granted, extended, changed, or amended by special law, except for municipal, charitable, educational, penal, or reformatory corporations, which are to remain under the patronage and control of the state. So
Translate that, please.
absolutely, and I'll give you a brief 30-second history lesson about the General Assembly as well. So the simplest way to put that is that the General Assembly does not have the constitutional authority to incorporate corporations at large, but you do have the express and exclusive authority to incorporate municipal corporations, educational corporations, reformatory and penal corporations. And it does say that the General Assembly has the authority to also incorporate charitable corporations as well. But you do not do that anymore. The 30-second history lesson is that prior to the incorporation of Section 69 into Chapter 2 of the Vermont Constitution, the General Assembly incorporated all of the corporations in the state. Nonprofits, private corporations. There was a desk in what is now the Legislative Lounge where what would be known as the Secretary of State sat and essentially approved all of the petitions that would come before the General Assembly to be approved as corporations. And occasionally you will hear from members of your district who will reach out. This might take 10, 20, 30 years for one to pop up, but it does pop up consistently. That say, I found an act from 1815 that says that my Masonic lodge or nonprofit charitable house or just plain old railroad corporation is exempt from property tax or has some sort of special authority. Is this act still valid? And that is because in the 19th century, the General Assembly was still passing special acts that relate to those corporations. And the answer very frequently is, oh yeah, that's still valid law. We deal with this a lot because at the time, the General Assembly was also incorporating churches. And there are quite a few religious corporations that reach out about the status of their charters. And I could send you a list of the various churches throughout the state that were incorporated by the General Assembly, but there were some fascinating names, like 20 title long names for some of the churches. The Society for the Propagation of the Foreign Parts, Church of Virgins.
So those agreements are still valid.
In all likelihood, yes, unless they've been expressly superseded by other law, which is a great segue into some of the general discussion here about charters.
Sandy, go ahead.
Could you repeat that first sentence? You said General Assembly does not have the authority to
Incorporate corporations
corporations.
except municipal, charitable, educational, reformatory, and penal corporations. If you think about all the subordinate units of government, you control and charter all of them. You just don't charter private corporations. That's the exclusion in Section 69.
So we still can charter charitable organizations?
It's included in Section 69.
Okay.
And I
understood that to be no longer, but that makes more sense to me. Thank you.
So a great way to segue into Charter Law 101 writ large, which is that whenever we use the term charter, I feel like it carries with it a lot of meaning for members and for the public that is not part of the law around municipal charters. Simplest way to put what a charter is, it is a special act of the General Assembly. It is still state law. This is not local law. This is statute. It governs one jurisdiction, typically a single municipal corporation. Sometimes it is a group of municipal corporations, such as a district, a multi-member district. Could be larger than that. I was in House Education this morning discussing what the incorporation of large school districts might look like, depending on the model that is chosen by the General Assembly. So you could be dealing with potentially in a charter, a governmental corporation that spans dozens of municipalities potentially. Regional government can be chartered as well. But again, these are just special acts. You will also hear in this realm the use of the term Dillon's rule. And does anyone remember what Dillon's rule is in a nutshell?
Of course, as we create, so may we destroy.
That is the best way. That's my favorite line from Dillon's rule.
Yes,
Say that again.
as we create, so may we destroy. And furthermore, so may we what, amend and what is it?
Municipal corporations owe their origin to and derive their powers and rights wholly from the legislature. It breathes into them the breath of life, without which they cannot exist. As it creates, so may it destroy. If it may destroy, it may abridge and control. And it goes on to say that if you could conceive of so great a folly in a single stroke of the pen, you could wipe the slate clean and eliminate all the municipal corporations that exist within your state.
Pretty powerful.
Dillon's rule is a judicial gloss. It is the result of court decisions. The first was from the Supreme Court of Iowa. That those words were written by a justice on the Supreme Court of Iowa, John Forrest Dillon, which is why it's called Dillon's rule. And John Forrest Dillon later wrote kind of the predominant treatise on municipal corporations. It was used to understand the relationship between the state and all of the municipal corporations within the state. And it essentially establishes a hierarchy of law, right? The state, by virtue of its status, must have the highest priority of law. It can't be superseded by subordinate units of local government. Otherwise, you would grant to those municipal corporations the ability to essentially veto the decisions of the legislature if they had the power to do so. All of this stems from issues that arose in colonial America with the city of Philadelphia, which at one time was the cultural center of the world. It was called Little Athens. And under the frame of government in colonial Pennsylvania at the time, municipal corporations had quite a bit of power, even though the city of Philadelphia didn't have a charter. And decisions of their colony-wide assembly were essentially being superseded by the city. And they said, uh-oh. And they adopted the equivalent of what we have in Section 6 of the Vermont Constitution as part of the first 1777 Constitution of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which was copied by the state of Vermont. Whole cloth, every single word, which is why the term boroughs appears in the language that I read to you. I'm going a little bit too wonky and deep here, but
It's you, Tucker.
It's 2:02 now instead of 9.
Yeah, all right.
2:30. One other question. You said Title II, Section.
so the constitutional provisions I read were Chapter 2, Section 2, the supreme legislative power, Chapter 2, Section 6, legislative powers, and then Chapter 2, Section 69, charters, limit on the right to grant.
Like to read the.
Me too.
Go ahead, Kate.
Let's start a Green Book Club.
Do you know, I'm sure you do, why Vermont chose Dillon's rule versus home rule and what the difference is like?
The vast majority of states use Dillon's rule. And that is basically just a form of the Constitution where municipal corporations are created by the General Assembly, by the legislative branch of government. And the reason that showed up in the early frames of government and then eventually in all of the early constitutions was that chartering was originally done by the king, as in the King of England. So you'll sometimes hear this statement that has become popular. I think the earliest source was a law review article by Paul Gillies, who testified in here on the Bennington 1 review. And the popular quote is that cities came first in Vermont. There were cities and then the state. Like that the state owes its origin to the fact that there were municipalities here first. But those municipalities owed their creation to the governor of New Hampshire, Benning Wentworth. Yes, that's why it's called Bennington. But Benning Wentworth, on behalf of the king, chartered individual municipalities in unoccupied territory that is now Vermont in order to combat interests from New York, who were also issuing charters along Lake Champlain, and to fend off the French seigneuries in Quebec that were granting land to French royalty or sub-royalty at the time, also along Lake Champlain. And Benning Wentworth said, let's start claiming this for the King of England, and began chartering square-shaped municipalities all over what is now Vermont. They had charters that gave them express rights, told them how they were supposed to run their annual meetings, when the annual meeting dates were going to be, and reserved the tallest of the white pines in the municipality to be cut and shipped to the king for the use of masts. It also stated that land was to be divided by lot. So they would take the name of people mostly from Connecticut and Massachusetts who were interested in getting land in Vermont. They would draw it out of a hat and they would give them the lot of land according to the number they drew from the hat, except that a large tract of land in every single municipality was to be dedicated as the governor's lot And the governor was granted that land in every single municipality. It went to Benning Wentworth. And the surveyors at the time did this really cool radical thing where they would occasionally put the governor's grant in the lake or at the top of a mountain and say, good luck getting your free land now, because all the good soil is going to the people who are drawing by lot. And eventually, Vermont came into a political crisis, which is that New Hampshire and New York had been granted statehood and were debating who owns Vermont. And Vermont said, we own ourselves. And here are our boundaries based on the municipal corporations that exist. And they ratified all the charters at the time. It was one of their very first acts, was to ratify the charters of the municipal corporations. And they borrowed, almost down to the letter, the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, because the drafters thought that it looked pretty good. And that's why we have a lot of what is now Chapter 1 of the Vermont Constitution, the articles, and many of the provisions related to the three branches of government.
Not having grown up in Vermont and studied Vermont history as a kid, who came together in the very beginning? And obviously, it was the Allen brothers, but who else came together to draft that first? You know, we're going to ratify this Constitution. We're going to. How did they figure it all out?
The only other name that I can think of, and I'm not even certain that this person was there for the actual founding, I think that this was post-founding, is Moses Robinson. And there's a book that was published, I think, by the Vermont Bar Association that tracks some of Moses Robinson's involvement in early Vermont.
So somehow they had possession of documents that showed all of the different charters and where they were on a map.
And in fact, you have possession of them as well. So if you're ever interested in looking at some of those initial charters, I had to do a lot of research on this when the glebe crisis happened. I don't know if any of you were here for the glebes. Everybody has glebe land. Yeah. Well, everyone used to have glebe land. Then the General Assembly gave the glebe land interest to municipal corporations and allowed the municipal corporations to dissolve their title interest in the land and give it to the property owners. We don't have to get into glebes. It's very complicated, but I had to go back and look at a lot of the colonial charters because that's the location where the glebes were established. You can find the original charters in the State Papers of New Hampshire, which are available online. There's 20 something volumes. Each one has like 1,000 pages in it. And it covers everything from communication between Governor Wentworth and various parties, but also all of the land grants in New Hampshire and what is now Vermont. You can also take a look at the early surveyors papers. There's a volume that was put together. I believe Paul Gillies is the one who actually put it together. The surveyors papers of Vermont, which are from General Whitelaw's initial survey of the state of Vermont, and those are kept in the Secretary of State's office. There is a published volume somewhere, but I don't think that very many copies have endured.
Oh, interesting. So none of this is really in our state archives.
A lot of it is.
It is, okay, because we did a field trip there a couple of years ago.
The Constitution.
We did.
Yeah.
It's cool.
And scarily enough, some folks that we were with from a sister committee pointed to it and said, that's what we're trying to change. It was really frightening.
It's been changed. If you look at the original one, I was allowed to put on the special gloves and hold it at one point, and I felt like I was going to sneeze. So I had to immediately leave the vault, and I had a little bit of a panic. I didn't want to destroy it with a
Oh,
sneeze.
wow. It is currently under glass. When we
Yes.
thought it was under glass, maybe from that incident? I don't know.
I retained the sneeze. There was no sneeze. It just,
I have a copy of ours for the town of Dorset in my vault.
the charter.
The charter.
Yes.
By the King of England.
Mhm.
Wow.
Wentworth.
There's a surprising number of original documents that are kept in the clerk's vaults of the municipalities, including some of the original surveyor maps.
And all the squares.
Yes, they are. And the towns were supposed to be squares too, in theory, but the surveyor's equipment that they used was just not super accurate. And there's a lot of funny stories about how much drinking happened at the time the surveying was done. So there's lots of misshapen municipalities in Vermont. And that's how you get gores. They would map a square, but they wouldn't get the shape right, probably where there was a mountain. And then 100 years later, there'd be unoccupied territory that was not in a municipal corporation. And those are the gores.
Like Buell's Gores.
Buell's Gore.
It's a little.
Great.
Warren's Grant. And then Averill, Ferdinand, and a few others that are up in that northeastern area.
I always wondered about those.
Yes.
That's
The-
fascinating.
What are they called? The unorganized towns and gores of Essex County,
Who's for?
UTGs, yeah. Swinging back to the charters. Every time that you amend, adopt a municipal charter, you are enacting special law, typically that is going to act as an exception to general law governing the same subject. You're only granting it to one municipality at a time or to one regional corporation at a time, but you are still putting language out, enacting law that is viewed as an exception wherever it is inconsistent with the general law. There are Supreme Court decisions that say that charter language will be harmonized to the maximum extent possible with general law governing the same subject. So, for example, if a municipal corporation adopts some special form of tax, but it is silent on procedure, the general law procedure governing, for example, the expansion of a taxing district will still go, because you haven't delegated that authority expressly to the municipal corporation. Dillon's rule plays a role here, and that any doubt as to whether a power exists for a municipal corporation will be strictly construed against the municipal corporation, right? Retaining that power at the state level. Every time there is power granted to a municipal corporation within a charter, that is your power. You are delegating legislative authority to another unit of government. It is subject to the same analysis as when you delegate authority to the executive branch or the judicial branch. So you can think of rulemaking authority as an example of where you delegate your constitutional lawmaking authority to another branch. However, you do have that gloss of Dillon's rule where the analysis of what power is being delegated is going to be more strictly construed than in other contexts. Do we have any discussion about or questions about delegations of legislative authority?
I have so many.
Okay.
Okay, so I was just thinking about how, when we were talking about Bennington and how when Betsy Ann came in and gave us all those previous cases of like what the legislature did, this is kind of different, but it made me think about precedent, right? So do we consider at all when we're looking at a charter, or should we, or have we considered what kind of legal implications there would be if we said, yes, town of XYZ, you have this charter, we are going to grant you this authority, but next town over, town ABC, we are going to say no to you. Is there a process for challenging that, or saying you allowed them to do that, now you have to allow us to do it? Or is it just whatever as the legislature we feel like doing?
The latter. So
Okay.
there's There's no requirement that just because you've delegated specific authority to one municipal corporation that it's supposed to be available under some sort of, for example, constitutional standard to every other municipal corporation. In fact, the whole point of special law is that you have the ability to treat different corporations differently. It is part of your express authority under the Vermont Constitution. So no, there's no legal precedent that could be used to compel you to grant your authority to a municipal corporation. So if the chartered municipality of Tuckertown is granted the authority to regulate drones, then the town of Shaytown couldn't then go to a court of competent jurisdiction and say, Tuckertown has this authority, you must compel the General Assembly to give it to my town as well.
Because it's always within
Because it is
our authority.
your discretion.
Interesting.
A similar parallel, could an administrative agency, could Forest Parks and Recreation sue to get all the powers that you have granted to the Department of Health?
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. There are lots of policy considerations that come into play there. And some of the things that I've heard legislators discuss as part of the charter subcommittee that existed 5 or 6 years ago, and just in this committee in general, is, are you looking at communities of scale when you're talking about delegated authority? What's the capacity of the municipality, municipality A versus municipality B, to be able to actually implement these things? What are the words on the page? And that's the one that Legislative Council focuses on the most, and that I always point out. I pointed out in a few of the charters that you've already passed through the committee this session is, yes, this power has been granted in another charter, but the words here are different. And because the words are different, it is likely that a court would interpret the delegation of this authority differently. It's one of the concerns that I flag consistently with some of the general powers language that pops up in every new charter is there are 30 different versions of this language that exist in Title 24 Appendix. And at some point, this might be interpreted differently by a court than some of the other municipalities that have this section of law.
So Tucker, is it preferable when we are incorporating or creating or amending a charter to use the same language over and over again, so it isn't subject to different interpretations?
If you are looking for consistency of outcome, and particularly if the request to the General Assembly and your committee is, we want to have the same power as municipality X, it is best to use consistent language to ensure that you're granting the same authority, and to ensure that if it was subject to a legal challenge at some point, that a court would have the same analysis of that language for both municipalities.
And as our council, when we ask you to bring a charter change, do you typically do that? You try to use standard language?
So from the outset, when a charter comes from certified by the Secretary of State and a member requests the introduction of a bill to approve it, I do as little as possible to alter what is sent by the Secretary of State, unless the sponsor of the bill asks me to do something different or directs me to do something differently. The only things that I consistently change in drafting charter as introduced is to make sure that it conforms to the standards of the Vermont Statutes Annotated. So that would be things like grammar, lists, sensitive terms, making sure that we don't have too many legalistic issues. So that would be here and afters and heretofores and forthwiths. We attempt to clean up as much of that as possible.
I love a good forthwith.
And corrections to cross references that are inaccurate. So that's one that's fairly common in the language that the General Assembly receives from the municipalities, that often there will be an error in the statutes that are cross-referenced within a charter. Other than that, nothing substantive is changed, and even where the language could be improved, I would never do that without direction from the sponsor of the bill telling me, please make this section consistent with what Colchester did or Burlington did or whatever the direction might be.
So when a town puts the language on a ballot, are they getting the language sometimes from another charter, sometimes from another town's charter, or sometimes they're just making it up on their own? And how is that language, who translates that language into legalese? Is that you? Is that the Secretary of State's office? Or is it working with the bill sponsor?
So to clarify some of the roles here under 17 VSA 2645, the municipal corporation's choosing all the language. It is printed on the ballot.
Yep.
The voters approve it. They send all of the required charter materials to the Secretary of State's office. Secretary of State's role in this is really just to essentially run down the checklist of documents in 17 VSA 2645, checking off, yep, these are all here. They photocopy the entire thing and they send it to a list of statutory recipients, which Senate Secretary, House Clerk, Attorney General, yours truly. And then my role is follow client direction. And if the request is just put the charter in, then I don't alter anything. I will flag for the committee during the walkthrough, here are the issues in this section. Here are some of the things you might consider. Here are discrete policy choices that are embedded in this language that even the municipality may not have been aware of when they were voting on it. Not a judgment of the municipal corporations, just say it frequently happens that the use of certain terms has unintended consequences that gets caught in committee occasionally.
So I haven't done a charter change yet, but I'm aware that a municipality that I represent has some items that were either voted down or voted for on the ballot recently at town meeting. Some were voted up, some were voted down. So where do I, as their representative, come into this process? I mean, clearly they should let me know that they have a charter change that they're working on. But who actually, and I thought it was me, was supposed to request that charter from legislative council, like I'm requesting a bill.
Members, it is
That's
a charter is just a bill. So going back to the first thing I noted, like the use of the term charter, I feel like evokes all sorts of things that aren't there. This is just a bill. It's going to be an act of the General Assembly. It's going to be codified in the green books. So a member must request the approval of the charter amendments through a bill.
Okay, so if they send it to the Secretary of State's office without talking to their representative, it
Mhm.
goes to you at some point.
And Betsy and
Right. So what happens to it before a member requests a bill, if you already have it in your possession?
I save it
Okay.
and it is labeled as, in brackets, whatever the municipality name is, charter.
Mhm.
And I wait for the
Okay.
members to request it.
Great.
There are times where several months go by and I will reach out to the delegation that represents that municipality and say, I am not indicating that this should happen.
Right.
I am just saying that it was delivered by the Secretary of State 3 months ago. And I just wanted to make sure that you're aware that a charter from your municipality is hanging out there and has not been requested for introduction yet.
Do you see municipalities, if certain ballot items were voted down, waiting for the next election before they revote on those items and then submitting a charter change to the Secretary of State? Or are they required to deliver whatever one's passed to the Secretary of State immediately?
There is a time limit in 17 VSA 2645 for the municipal clerk to deliver the results of the election for the charter votes. So it might even be within 10 days
Okay.
is when they have to deliver it, certify it and deliver it to the Secretary of State. We've talked a lot about some of the pro forma procedural aspects of charters, but I just want to remind you that municipalities don't actually have to go through that process, because ultimately this is all under your control. You could amend a charter without a vote. You could amend a charter despite the fact that there was some defect in the procedure. It has happened quite a few times in my tenure where this committee has investigated some sort of error during a charter vote, found that there was a problem, and still moved forward with some of the proposals. The last one that I can remember being a very detailed investigation of what happened at a local vote was the town of Bennington. And this was during the time Representative Townsend was the chair, I believe. So this must have been 6 years ago, maybe.
Probably before that.
But the issue that happened there was really just that it was a special election. And at the special election, all of the charter proposals were put on the ballot as one question. So with one question, do you approve the charter amendments? They followed all the other provisions of the charter amendment procedure. But the issue was that the voters were not given the option to vote on each of the discrete proposals. And it was everything from granting authority to regulate drones, which is where I pulled the example of for Tuckertown earlier, to expansion of a downtown improvement district taxing map, to some other changes in their authority, for example, to regulate plastic bags. But it was all one question, and the committee had discomfort with whether the voters were adequately informed. So the decision the committee came to, despite those errors, was to move forward charter amendments that cleaned up language, that made adjustments to the governmental aspects of the town, but not anything that would expand legislative authority, especially into some of those issues that were before the General Assembly at the time, including the plastic bag ban.
I can try.
Are there other questions you've always had about charters and how they work? You know, I can note some. I can note some peculiarities here. Section 1 is always the approval of whatever the amendment or adoption is. That's just a session law provision that records the date that the voters approved and expresses the General Assembly's approval of the charter amendments. Section 2 will always amend the chapter that the charter is kept within in its entirety. And that's just so that you see the name of the municipality first, and then you see all the changes that are happening for that municipality afterwards. And all of the charters are take effect on passage. That has just been a tradition. Other peculiarities, the House rules have exceptions for charters. Charters are not subject to the request deadline. They are not subject to the introduction deadline. A question that I get frequently is, are they subject to crossover? Crossover is not in rules. It's an agreement between the chambers. So there's no exemption for charters from crossover, but I have only seen one charter be held in Senate rules for a prolonged period of time where it did not get taken up during the session that it was passed by the House. And that was the first time that Montpelier proposed non-citizen voting in local elections. It was held in Senate rules and the session ended, the biennium ended, and it carried over to the next year.
Nugent.
I'm just really curious about like home rule and Dillon's rule,
Okay.
and have any states ever gone from Dillon's rule to home rule? Because
I'm not sure how many states have amended their constitution to transition fully from Dillon's rule to home rule where municipal corporations have inherent authority. I know of one state that has over time adopted what might be considered a hybrid, where there's still that kind of classic Dillon's rule, the General Assembly controls municipal corporations language, but municipal corporations of a certain size, there's a population threshold, are given specific powers, including some limited taxing authority, and that would be the Constitution of West Virginia. Home rule is a little misunderstood. I would say it's used as a foil to Dillon's rule. But Dillon's rule is going to apply in any state, regardless of whether the General Assembly has, pure plenary authority over municipal corporations or whether there's some control and power municipal corporations have. And that's because it is, again, a way for the courts to understand the hierarchy and relationship between the state and the subordinate units of local government. Home rule states grant some inherent authority to municipal corporations, typically within a constitution. There are some states that have navigated a statutory grant of authority that might be considered home rule. An important thing to remember about those home rule states is that state law is still going to control. And you can think of the dynamic there as similar to states in the federal government under the 10th Amendment to the US Constitution. The states have authority, but wherever the federal government has fully occupied a space, the states lose their authority to essentially supersede what is the highest law of the land, US Constitution, federal law. Same thing happens in home rule states. Municipal corporations may have some power, but wherever the state has, expressly occupied certain areas of law, set prohibitive standards in certain areas of law, municipal corporations are not allowed to supersede or adopt inconsistent local law. Federal preemption as kind of the model for understanding how that would work out in a home rule state.
The drug world.
Yeah, well, really, for many things where there's federal law governing interstate commerce, you can think of quite a few. There is one notable exception in that world of federal preemption, which is very interesting. It's part of this committee's jurisdiction. I'm looking at the chair. The chair should know.
What was the question again?
Federal preemption.
There's one area of law where the states have control and federal preemption is evaluated differently.
Oh, liquor.
I was gonna say alcohol. That's why I was leaning into alcohol at first, but I wanted to say election.
Representative Hango.
I know. That was my first
Gold
instinct.
star of the day. I'll buy you some chocolates. You win. Alcoholic beverages.
Should have gone with my gut on that one.
First Amendment.
I knew it was one of two things.
Damn it.
Dry counties found.
Do we still have that?
There are dry towns in Vermont.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
Somebody just changed that, right? One of the
Yes.
towns just voted that out this year?
yes, for last year.
And you can also, it's why you have certain models of alcoholic beverage regulation, including the one Vermont uses where the state controls all spirituous liquors that are sold inside of its jurisdiction. Be an enterprise actor and exclude all other businesses from being able to occupy that space.
We had an interesting dalliance when we looked into that as a retail cannabis model. I ran into some interesting federal conundrums, given its classification.
Yes,
Yeah,
cannabis.
That seemed like a good idea for about 6.5 minutes.
Yeah. That's in House General,
Yes.
yeah,
Uh,
back in the day.
So
Anything else for Dara?
if there are other questions, happy to answer them. Otherwise, the only note that I'd have is maybe this is something that you'll be looking at fresh with the whole cloth creation potentially at some point of school districts. Right?
Right,
You're starting with the creation of a unit of government from scratch.
Only hope that we're.
Yeah.
We're just immersing ourselves in knowledge now.
We are.
Love it.
Thank you so much for the immersion.
I have a few guides that I'll send along that I used in prior biennia for introductions to some of these issues. So I'll send them. You can keep them in your pocket. That's the reference. Biennia. Right. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
You.
That's a wrap for the